This is a case analysis of a recorded sequence or a recorded interpretation in a county jail called By the Book. So as I mentioned, the setting was in the booking area of a jail, county jail, and the goal of the environment is essentially to keep the inmates secure and to keep them safe. The participants involved in this particular setting was an officer who was doing the booking and a deaf person, a white woman in 30s, I would say, who appears to be intoxicated. The officer is also white and about 30, and there was a white interpreter. So it was 3 participants. The terminology, a bit surprising to me how much was related to medical questioning, asking about various health-related questions, and so less legal than I had initially predicted for myself when uh, when thinking about this particular setting. But what I observed was a minority of the language being legalistic and most of it being medical. There was definitely a power differential, an interpersonal relationship between the officer and the deaf person who was being charged. The interpreter, of course, was in sort of had a different power place because she was there to interpret between the two of them. The physical setup had a desk behind which the officer was sitting and was working with a computer and a keyboard. The deaf person was sitting across the desk, could see the officer straight on, and the interpreter was standing to the side, to the left side, and a bit behind the officer on that side of the desk. In terms of the interpreter's pre-assignment controls, we're not really familiar based on the material we're given in print and what we see on the screen, what she actually did for prep in advance of this particular setting. Now I want to go through a number of the demands that came up during this interpreting sequence and kind of explore what happened and a little bit around the effectiveness of the control choices taken. The first demand I want to talk about is the frozen text. The pace was not significantly quick. I didn't see in my observations that the interpreter was having difficulty with the pace. It didn't seem to rise to the level of significance, but the tone and the delivery was very formal, and because it was frozen, it was read. Concurrent demands, and many of these demands will remain throughout the entire setting, the entire interpretation. The fact that the deaf person appeared to be under the influence and as such may not be understanding. She was demonstrating impatience and interrupting fairly frequently throughout the segment. So the interpreter was interpreting while the officer read, and her control decisions were to interpret simultaneously, to interpret in a very close to English contact variety of sign language, and she fingerspelled quite a few technical terms. Other overlapping demands included, while this was being read, the officer's radio would go off with someone saying something and that kind of scratchy sound that comes out of handheld radios. So I think that was a paralinguistic demand for the interpreter. Hard to hear in those instances where it came on. At the same time, I had the feeling, and I kind of inferred in her a little bit of annoyance, interpersonal demand, that the radio wasn't turned down and was interrupting from time to time. I also speculate that the interpreter was feeling nervous because this was being filmed, and so her work was going to be recorded, and that would present itself as an interpersonal demand. And in fact, in the readings related to this, that was a demand for her. So the effectiveness of the control to interpret simultaneously, to interpret in a context variety close to English, appears to be effective for this particular setting, because we did not see any resulting demand from the deaf person asking, "What do you mean by that?" to try and clarify any of the translation. Alternate controls, though, I would like to suggest here, if the deaf person was truly bilingual in English, then a control option would be to have the deaf person read what was written for themselves. Clearly, one could interpret more consecutively with the information. And again, this interpreter knew that deaf person, so her control choices were to go more English-like and less interpreting in ASL-like for that particular sequence. But those would be alternatives to consider should the demands around the language preferences of the deaf person be different. Another demand was the casualness and the insolence of the deaf consumer when speaking. And when I say speaking, I do mean signing. I use speaking interchangeably in these settings. So concurrent demands included her signing in a sloppy way, or with one hand, or holding up her head with another hand, and that with the continuing demand that the person was under the influence, all had to be taken in consideration by the interpreter. I also sensed that the interpreter had an interpersonal demand of discomfort due to the lack of deference that the deaf person had for the officer or for the setting. In addition, the deaf person was demonstrating impatience, asking, "Let's get on with this," not waiting for statements to be finished, and that kind of thing. So that was a lot of competing or overlapping demands. In terms of the actual main demand of how the deaf person was signing and the translation decisions that the interpreter was taking, she did go with the very casual English register, using comments like "yeah," "uh-huh," that kind of thing. And we learn after the setting in the debriefing notes that the interpreter said she was struggling with how to translate that information, how to adequately voice for a drunk individual whose signing was sloppy. In terms of its effectiveness, from my point of view, as well as some of the materials that we read, those translation decisions did achieve message equivalence. But during the post-assignment debriefing, the expert interpreter involved in this filming suggests that interpreters would want to err on the side of having more formal register in the interpretation and let the deaf person's visual actions be a sign of their intoxication. She also suggested it might have been helpful in maintaining the more formal register to limit eye contact with a deaf person to only the times when communication was happening. And this particular expert also stressed the need to walk a fine line between accurately representing the message of the deaf inmate and not creating an interpretation that annoys the booking officer because of its level of casualness. And juxtaposed to that, the interviews with the officers who were the one officer involved in the scenario and the one officer who was observing, is that they felt the whole experience was very similar to those that they've experienced in the past. So for me, that tends to suggest that the translation decisions by the interpreter were effective. Another demand that happened during this segment was while the interpreter was fingerspelling, and in this case it was inmate handbook, inmate was what she was fingerspelling, the deaf person missed or didn't understand the fingerspelling and asked, what was that? Asked for clarification. And keep in mind the continuing concurrent demands of the deaf consumer's intoxication and impatience, the formality of the setting, and so on. When the deaf person said, what did you just spell? The interpreter corrected or spelled again what she had fingerspelled. She didn't interpret that interchange. She didn't interpret the deaf person asking for the clarification. She just provided the clarification. And then the deaf person said, oh, I, not why. And that interchange, the interpreter chose to interpret into English. So a resulting demand was that the officer had to pause and figure out why, after having talked about the inmate handbook, the deaf person saying I, not why. And so that was a confusion for the officer, from which he, recovered quite quickly. Obviously, not an effective choice in terms of the actual sequence. Typically, the deaf person asks for clarification, you give it. If they gave you something back, you would just, in most situations, a control I think I would do is just let the process carry on and not interrupt the process with that, again, that little piece of clarification. But in the debriefing for this filming, the expert on legal settings did want to caution people that it's vital for interpreters to consistently be clear when they are the source of the messages, or during your interpretation you're being really clear on the source attribution. So the deaf person is asking for clarification. A control could be, Susan, can you sign that again? I didn't understand what you just said. And then the interpreter signs again what was said. And then in this case, the deaf person said, oh, okay, I misunderstood your spelling of Y versus I, or your articulation of it. So that's where source attribution could work for that particular scenario as an alternate control. However, I did want to add that in most settings, not maybe as serious as this, but in most settings, none of that needs to necessarily be interpreted. That kind of interchange to clarify our work is quite normal and doesn't need to be a part of the involving the second consumer. The interpreter for this setting did mention that a post-assignment control for her may have been around this particular source attribution question, was that she might clarify with the officer after the event at which point she had been speaking as the interpreter and at which point she had been interpreting the deaf person's information, just to make the whole interchange clear. Another demand that happened during this segment was that the deaf person simply closed her eyes. She just leaned on her elbow and had her eyes closed. Naturally, if a deaf person has their eyes closed, they're not listening, and those are terms I do use, listening and talking, when talking about deaf people. So she couldn't listen to what the officer was saying. The interpreter's control decision was to speak to the officer. Her eyes are closed. Well, she didn't say source attribution in terms of the interpreter saying this. It's very clear. Her eyes are closed. It means that I am speaking and we're referring to the deaf person. In this particular situation, the officer had controls of his own, or extra linguistic knowledge of his own about the deaf community because he reached over and touched the deaf consumer, Mary, to wake her up. I wouldn't necessarily expect that to be a quick response on the part of most hearing people. They might raise their voice. That would be a natural way to deal with someone whose eyes are closed who is hearing. So the officer did reach over to touch her to wake her up. Which kind of leads us to think in a case analysis what we might do as interpreters when we say her eyes are closed, that what resulting demands might happen. So in this case the officer touched her, but if other people didn't really understand the point of telling me why her eyes are closed, so alternate translations, or sorry, alternate comments could be, when her eyes are closed as you see them now, she can't hear what you're saying. Or there could be, that's a little bit wordy, but there could be alternatives that give the hearing person more cues to what's expected or the implications of the person having their eyes closed. So in this particular case, what she said was very effective, but it's worth noting for our own development some choices, some control choices around that for people who may be less familiar with working with deaf people. Another demand dealt with that series of medical questions that came up as part of the booking. During that sequence of questions, the translation control decisions of the interpreter, or not specifically translation, but the process control decisions, were to deal with the material almost entirely consecutively, hearing the question and then giving an interpretation. The interpreter also, throughout this time, you could see the computer monitor and was using that as a reference. And from time to time throughout this segment, there was overlapping where the deaf person would interrupt and the two were talking at the same time. So for those instances, the control the interpreter used was to, when getting back to the medical questions, was to very clearly say, go back to, could you repeat where it said, and then give the first couple of words. When she asked for that, it was very clear it was the interpreter asking the question. The volume changed, the tone of voice changed, it was very respectful, and it would have been very clear to the officer, aside from the actual words, could you start again, it was very clear that it was the interpreter asking for a repeat or to restart the question. So in that way, I feel it was effective. And I think the positive consequence of that control was that the officer knew what had not been interpreted yet, because he had already spoken the question or part of the question when the deaf person made her interjection. So he would have perhaps assumed that it had already been interpreted. So by asking for these repeats and to start again, he knew exactly where in the sequence of questions the interpretation was at. So that kind of gives you a sense of a number of events that happened during this segment of booking. What we know that the people involved in the filming did meet and talk afterwards. So I do think it was a post-assignment control to debrief and case conference the whole experience. We don't know much about the pre-assignment controls. We have a number of demands that came up throughout this particular segment, and then we have the post-assignment controls through the debriefing. I think that summarizes pretty much everything that I had to share about this particular observation. And for myself, generally, I feel that the event was effectively interpreted. It was interpreted closer to English contact variety that I would have naturally chosen. However, I haven't met that deaf person. It seems like it was a good match. It seems like the material was exchanged that needed to be exchanged. There were other competing demands that, due to the intoxication, we're assuming, of the deaf person, we weren't getting full disclosure of information in an articulate way. But the backdrop to that was that the interpreter had knowledge based on what the hearing person was saying, the officer was saying, was that things would be followed up on. So I'll conclude with that, and thank you for your time. All of this presentation, in conjunction with the documents I'm submitting, form this assignment. Thank you.